Welcome back, everybody, and let's jump right into another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at, it's basically a whole story arc packed into one chapter of the book of Genesis. It's chapter 37, the story of Joseph and his brothers.
I think a lot of people think they know this story. But what we're going to be doing today is going a bit deeper than, the Sunday school version. We're going to be talking about, some really fascinating power dynamics in ancient families,
Yeah.
all kinds of family drama. And of course, the kind of crazy plot twists that would make, I don't know, even like a Hollywood screenwriter jealous.
Yeah.
You
No,
know,
it's really something. And to help us break down all the historical and psychological layers in this chapter, we've got our expert here who, as always, sees all the connections that everybody else seems to miss.
Well, what I find fascinating about this story is it really gets down to the nitty gritty of family dynamics.
Yeah.
Stuff that is as relevant today as it was back then. We're looking at ambition, we're looking at insecurity, and the ripple effects of choices that maybe at the time didn't seem that significant, but really set off a chain reaction of events.
Absolutely. And it all kicks off with a patriarch who maybe isn't the best at hiding who his favorite son is. Jacob, father of 12 sons, develops, a particular fondness for young Joseph. I mean, the coat of many colors detail that's in the story, that doesn't exactly help Joseph fly under the radar, does it?
Yeah, it's a pretty clear sign.
Yeah.
And in that culture, it would have been, nobody would have missed it. It was a sign of you got to remember, back in these ancient patriarchal societies, the chosen heir, the one the father chose, was given immense power. So by publicly picking Joseph as a favorite, it wasn't just about who gets what when Jacob dies, but it was really impacting everybody's position within the family dynamic. And you can see how that would have planted the seeds for some pretty intense resentment.
Oh, yeah. Talk about sibling rivalry on steroids.
Yeah.
And poor Joseph, bless his heart, only 17 years old at the time. I mean, he probably thought he was just sharing some cool dreams he had, not realizing he was like pouring gasoline on a fire. In these dreams, he sees his brother's sheaves of grain bowing down to his sheaf. And then he even sees the sun and the moon and the 11 stars all bowing down to him. I don't know, maybe there was a little bit of teenage arrogance mixed in with those prophetic dreams, huh?
I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Was he intentionally provoking his brothers?
No.
Or was he just completely clueless? Either way, we have to remember how seriously people took dreams back then. Dreams were not just random things your brain did while you were sleeping. People actually believed that they contained messages from God, and they were thought to sometimes predict the future. And we're not talking about just, any old dream interpreter on the street corner either. They had, specialized people who had this role in society, and their interpretations could influence entire communities.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, so you can just imagine how Joseph's brothers reacted when he casually mentioned these, I don't know, power trip dreams over breakfast one morning. It's almost like he was, without realizing it, writing his own ticket out of there. I mean, their resentment towards him was already, pretty intense, but this just made it boil right over.
You can see that in the text, too. It literally says they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words. It wasn't just jealousy. I mean, they were scared. They felt threatened. They were afraid that they were losing their status in the family. Remember, in that culture, your identity was totally wrapped up in your father and your position within the family.
Yeah. That's a great point. Okay, so we've got unchecked jealousy. We've got a power vacuum,
Right.
And a dash of teenage drama. What could possibly go wrong, right?
Oh, yeah. So Jacob sends Joseph on what seems like a pretty harmless errand. Just go check on your brothers who are taking care of the flocks near Shechem. But Shechem itself is a significant place. It's mentioned a lot in Genesis, in earlier stories, and it was a big religious center. So that detail adds this kind of, layer of meaning to the story. You get this sense of the sacred and the profane kind of clashing.
So Joseph, totally unaware of all this, is strolling right into the middle of this powder keg. And his brothers, they see him coming from a distance, and it's like straight out of a movie. The text says, "Behold, this dreamer cometh." I mean, talk about foreshadowing. You can practically feel the tension building.
Oh, yeah. And they don't waste any time. The story shifts to Dothan, which is another place that has a lot of meaning. Dothan was known for its cisterns, which are these big, pits that they would use to collect rainwater. They're like lifelines in that region, which was really dry.
Yeah.
But in this story, the cistern becomes this symbol of, betrayal.
Because the moment Joseph shows up, His brothers decide they're going to throw him into one of these empty cisterns. It's really chilling, you know? You can practically feel the heat of their anger and their desperation to just shut this dreamer up and, get back the position they thought they had in the family.
And the fact that it happens in Dothan just adds to the drama. This place that was supposed to be about survival, providing water, it becomes this trap for Joseph.
Yeah.
It shows how even in places that seem safe, there can be this hidden danger lurking beneath the surface.
Yeah, good point. But wait, there's a little glimmer of hope here. Just when you think this is it for Joseph, his oldest brother, Reuben, steps in. Now, his motives are a little unclear, but he convinces the others not to actually kill Joseph, at least for now. So instead, they throw him in the cistern unharmed. Reuben's thinking he'll come back later and sneak Joseph back home.
This is a really important moment in the story. It shows that the brothers weren't all on the same page. Not everybody wanted to just murder him. And you see this moral complexity in the story, which is way more interesting than just, good guys and bad guys.
Right, exactly. It's more about, human nature, that struggle between doing what your impulses are telling you to do and what your conscience is telling you to do. But even Reuben's plan, which is already pretty risky, takes a totally unexpected turn because, as luck would have it, a caravan of merchants just happens to pass by. And not just any merchants, these are Ishmaelites and Midianites who are known for, traveling these long trade routes.
Oh, yeah, they were basically the international businessmen of the ancient world. And this encounter, it seems random, but it actually tells us a lot about how interconnected the ancient world was. I mean, these guys weren't just traders, they were like cultural bridges,
Yeah.
linking different regions and economies. And it makes the story feel real. It reminds us that even stuff that seems isolated was usually part of something much, much bigger.
Okay, so now we've got these well-timed international businessmen making a cameo. I'm guessing they don't just stop to chat about the weather, right?
Right. And one of the brothers, Judah, he sees an opportunity. Instead of killing Joseph, he suggests selling him to the merchants. So all of a sudden, the story goes from attempted murder to international human trafficking. And the price they agree on, 20 pieces of silver, which, if you know your Bible, is a detail that'll pop up again later in the story.
Oh, yeah. 20 pieces of silver. It's like every number and every detail in this story has a deeper meaning. What's so special about 20 pieces of silver?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. There's no such thing as just a random detail in this story. Back then, 20 pieces of silver was the standard price for a slave. So it represented a human life being reduced to just a commodity. And like you said, it kind of foreshadows another betrayal that happens later in the Bible, and that has the same price tag. So you get this sense of a connection between these two events.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Wow. I mean, in just a few verses, we've gone from sibling rivalry to a murder plot, a last-minute rescue, and now Joseph's basically being shipped off to Egypt like a piece of merchandise. It's insane how fast things escalate.
Absolutely. And it really makes you think about, are these events just random bad luck? Or is there something bigger going on? Is there a purpose to this whole chaotic mess? And that's the question that's going to keep popping up as we follow Joseph on his journey.
I mean, I think we all know the answer to that one. But before we get to Joseph's Egyptian adventure, let's rewind for a second and go back to Canaan and see how the brothers handle this PR nightmare. Because I'm guessing they can't exactly tell Dad that they, sold his favorite son into slavery.
Oh, no. Their solution is to create this elaborate cover story. And it actually adds this whole other layer of cruelty to what they did. They take Joseph's coat, the famous one that caused so much trouble in the first place, and they dip it in goat's blood.
No way. They really did that. I mean, that's just cold. What were they trying to do with that?
Well, they take this bloody coat to Jacob and tell him they found it out in the wilderness. So they're implying that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. It's just this calculated act of deception. They're trying to manipulate their father into feeling sorry for them so he doesn't suspect anything.
Wow. And how does Jacob react to this? I mean, losing a son, especially under those circumstances, it must have been devastating.
Oh, yeah. The text describes his grief in really vivid detail. He tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth, which were the classic signs of deep mourning in that culture. And he just refuses to be comforted. You can just feel the depth of his pain. It really highlights those strong emotional bonds within families and just how devastating it is to lose someone you love.
Man, that's just heartbreaking. And it shows how much damage the brothers caused with their actions. They didn't just betray Joseph, they ripped their whole family apart. And now their father's left to deal with this unimaginable pain. And meanwhile, Joseph, completely oblivious to the chaos he left behind, he's on his way to Egypt. And his future's completely uncertain. The chapter ends with him being sold to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials.
And that little detail about Potiphar's job, that's actually really important because he wasn't just some random guy. He's described as the captain of the guard, which means he was in charge of protecting Pharaoh. So he would have been really powerful and influential in Egyptian society. This wasn't just a slave owner. This was somebody who had access to the highest levels of power in Egypt.
Okay, so let's recap for a second. We've got a teenage dreamer who's been sold into slavery, a heartbroken father, and a bunch of brothers who are drowning in guilt and lies. This is already way more drama than an episode of, I don't know, your average reality TV show, but I have a feeling this is just the beginning.
Yeah, we're just getting started. This chapter lays the foundation for an incredible story that explores, themes of betrayal and forgiveness and the strange ways in which God sometimes works through, even terrible things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you were Joseph at the end of this chapter, knowing what you know about his family, about his dreams, and about how he ended up in Egypt, what would be your biggest fear? What would you be hoping for?
That's a great question. Because we know how the story ends, but we don't really know what Joseph was thinking or feeling along the way, right?
Yeah.
So that's where the real power of this story lies, in those unspoken thoughts and emotions that shape a person's life.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll be exploring next time. We'll dive into Joseph's experiences in Egypt and talk about his strength, his intelligence, and that unwavering faith he had. So until then, keep thinking about that question, and I'll see you back here soon for the next part of our deep dive.
It's amazing to think about what's going on, in Joseph's head during all this. I mean, we've seen the betrayal and the horrible journey and the shock of being sold as a slave.
Mm.
But what about Joseph's inner world? I mean, how is he dealing with all this trauma? Remember, he's just a kid, and he's been thrown into this totally strange and scary environment.
It's hard to even imagine, right? Being ripped away from everything you know.
Yeah.
Betrayed by your own family, and then sold into slavery. That's got to leave some serious emotional scars. How does somebody even begin to pick up the pieces and, rebuild their life after something like that?
And that's what makes Joseph so fascinating. I mean, that resilience, that ability to hold on to some kind of hope when everything seems hopeless. It's like at the core of who he is. And I think it speaks to something that's true about all of us, Even when things are really, really bad, we can adapt. We can learn. We can find ways to not only survive, but to actually thrive.
Okay, so let's follow Joseph as he figures out this new reality in Egypt. He's been bought by Potiphar, this, high-ranking official in Pharaoh's court. What can you tell us about Potiphar? What was his role? I mean, what kind of world has Joseph been thrown into?
Well, like I said before, Potiphar was the captain of the guard, which meant he was responsible for keeping Pharaoh safe. So he wasn't just some rich guy. He was right at the center of power in Egypt. I mean, he had been in all the important meetings. He knew all the secrets. He had a ton of influence. So Joseph, even though he's a slave, he's landed in this, very privileged position. Of course, is also pretty dangerous.
Yeah, that's a big jump, going from shepherd to a slave in the house of one of the most powerful men in Egypt. So what was slavery like in ancient Egypt? Was it all, backbreaking labor and cruelty, or was there more to it?
Well, slavery back then was complicated. It wasn't as simple as we might think. Yeah, some slaves had it really rough. But others, especially those in these elite households, like Potiphar's house, they could actually have a lot of responsibility and even be kind of comfortable. It's like a hierarchy within a hierarchy.
And it seems like Joseph was really good at moving up those ladders. The Bible actually describes him as a prosperous man in Potiphar's house. So he wasn't just some servant, right? He was basically running the place, like a chief of staff or something.
Yeah. It's like Joseph, no matter what situation you put him in, he had this natural talent for leadership and management. He's smart, he works hard, and Potiphar starts to trust him, which is huge. It's almost like he's, destined for something big, even as a slave. But things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. Because now we got to talk about Potiphar's wife.
Oh, yeah. Potiphar's wife, definitely not something you hear about in Sunday school. She develops let's just say she takes a liking to Joseph, and she's not shy about letting him know it.
This is where the story takes this really interesting turn. It's all about temptation and desire and what happens when people give in to those urges. Potiphar's wife, she's driven by lust. And she tries to seduce Joseph, over and over again.
And Joseph, to his credit, he resists her. He even says, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? I mean, talk about integrity. Here he is, a slave in a foreign land, and he's sticking to his principles, even though it could cost him everything.
Right. He knows what's right and what's wrong, even when he's tempted to do otherwise, and he understands that his actions have consequences, not just for him, but for how God sees him.
But saying no to Potiphar's wife, well, it doesn't exactly make her happy. Things get pretty intense, and eventually she accuses him of assault, which of course lands Joseph in prison, again, totally innocent.
And this whole episode is a reminder of how dangerous false accusations can be, especially when there's this huge power difference between people. It's scary to think that even when you try to do the right thing, you can still become the victim of, somebody else's lies and cruelty.
It's like Joseph can't catch a break. But even in prison, he manages to stand out. He earns the trust of the warden, and before you know it, he's in charge of the other prisoners. I mean, this guy's got leadership skills. No matter how bad the situation is, he finds a way to rise to the top.
It's amazing, right? He's not just surviving, he's making things better. And it's while he's in prison that the story takes another crazy turn. He meets two of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. They're also in prison. And guess what? They've been having some weird dreams that they need help understanding.
Hold on, I think I know where this is going. Joseph, the dream interpreter, is back in business. Remember those prophetic dreams that got him into so much trouble with his brothers? Well, guess what? Those same skills are about to save him.
Exactly. It's like these, random talents that once caused him so much pain are now going to be his ticket out of prison. So Joseph interprets the dreams of these two officials. He tells the cupbearer he's going to get his job back. And he tells the baker he's, not going to be so lucky. And you know what? Everything happens just like he predicted. The cupbearer is back in Pharaoh's good graces.
What a moment, right? It seems like finally things are going Joseph's way. I mean, you'd think the cupbearer, now that he's free and back in his fancy job, would remember the guy who helped him, right? Maybe put in a good word for Joseph with Pharaoh.
Well, here's the thing. The cupbearer, he gets out of prison and completely forgets about Joseph. Back to the palace, living the good life, and doesn't give Joseph a second thought.
Oh, come on. You gotta be kidding. Poor Joseph, back to square one, stuck in prison while the cupbearer's, sipping wine with Pharaoh. It makes you wonder if there's any justice in the world.
But here's the thing. Even though this seems like a huge setback, it's actually a really important turning point. It's like the calm before the storm. Because while the cupbearer might have forgot about Joseph, someone else is about to have a dream that changes everything.
Okay, so we're back, and things are about to get really, really interesting. Last time, we left Joseph, basically running Egypt. Well, back in Canaan, his brothers are dealing with this terrible famine. And guess what? They have to go to Egypt to get food. Talk about irony, right?
Oh, yeah. It's like the story itself is setting us up for this big confrontation. You got the brothers, desperate for food. They got to travel to Egypt. And they have no clue they're about to come face to face with the brother they betrayed.
Okay, so picture this. The brothers, they arrive in Egypt. They're tired, they're hungry, and they're about to beg for food from the most powerful man in Egypt, who just happens to be, the brother they sold into slavery. I mean, what do you think is going through their minds when they first meet him?
It's an incredible scene. You can just imagine it, right? The brothers, totally humbled, standing before this Egyptian official. Their lives are literally in his hands. And Joseph, on the other side, he sees his brothers, but he doesn't let them know who he is.
I mean, it's like a psychological thriller or something. He could just, expose them right there, get his revenge for all those years of suffering. But that's not how Joseph rolls. He's got a different plan.
Right. He doesn't give himself away right away. Instead, he kind of messes with them. He accuses them of being spies. He even throws them in prison for a while. It's like he's setting up this, real life test of their character. He wants to see if they've changed, if they feel any guilt for what they did.
It's actually really smart. I mean, by putting them through this whole ordeal and, dropping these little hints about their past, he's trying to figure out if they're truly sorry, if they've, grown up and become better people.
And the best part is they have no idea who he is. So imagine the pressure they must be feeling. All that guilt from their past is coming back to haunt them. And they don't even realize they're standing right in front of the brother they wronged.
Talk about dramatic irony. It's like watching one of those, disaster movies where something bad's going to happen, but the characters have no clue. So how long does Joseph keep up this act? When does the truth finally come out?
Well, the turning point is when Joseph, he tells them they had to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, to Egypt. And the brothers, especially Judah, the one who wanted to sell Joseph in the first place, they totally freak out.
Uh-huh. So it's all catching up to them now, huh? All that guilt they've been trying to bury, it's all coming back to the surface. And now Benjamin, the one they promised to protect, he's being dragged into this whole mess.
That's brilliant, right? Joseph's forcing them to face their biggest fears, to remember what they did to him. But this time, they're the ones who are helpless.
And how do they react? Do they just, hand over Benjamin?
Well, this is where Judah really steps up. He basically begs Joseph. He offers to become a slave in Benjamin's place. He's willing to sacrifice himself to protect his little brother. It's like a total transformation. He's not selfish anymore. He actually cares about somebody else.
Wow. So maybe Judah and maybe some of the other brothers too, they've actually changed. They've learned their lesson. They're not driven by envy or just trying to save themselves anymore.
And that's when Joseph, he can't hold it in anymore. All the emotion comes pouring out. And he tells him who he is. He says, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt.
Oh, man. Can you imagine? They must have been totally floored. Like, wait, what? This whole time, the guy who's been in charge of everything, it's been Joseph.
The Bible says they were troubled at his presence. And I bet they were. They probably thought, okay, this is it. He's going to make us pay for what we did.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't you? But that's not what happens, right? Instead of revenge, Joseph offers them forgiveness. He understands that even though what they did was terrible, it was all part of this, bigger plan, something they couldn't understand at the time.
It's amazing. This is the moment that takes the story to a whole other level. It's not just about betrayal and getting even anymore. It's about forgiveness, about how God can work through, even the worst situations to bring about something good.
Yeah, and he even says to them, be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. It's incredible. He doesn't hold a grudge. He understands that everything happens for a reason.
It's a powerful message. Even the worst betrayal, the deepest hurt, it can be a chance to grow, to forgive.
Yeah.
And to, find a way to come back together.
So the brothers, they're reunited after all these years. And Jacob, their father, he's overjoyed to hear that Joseph's alive. The whole family moves to Egypt, where they're safe and well fed during the famine. It's a happy ending. It shows the power of family and how forgiveness can heal even the deepest wounds.
But it's also a story that makes us think, what does it really mean to forgive? How do you move on after someone's hurt you really badly? And how do we make sense of suffering? Those things in life that seem totally unfair, but maybe, just maybe, are part of a bigger plan that we can't quite see yet.
Yeah, you're right. Joseph's story, it's not just some ancient tale. It's like a mirror, It shows us our own struggles with betrayal and forgiveness and trying to find meaning in a world that can be pretty messed up.
It's a story that's still relevant today. It challenges us, it inspires us, and it reminds us that no matter how bad things get, there's always hope. There's always a chance for forgiveness, and there's always the possibility of starting over.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Genesis chapter 37. We've been through betrayal, slavery, prison, and finally, forgiveness and reconciliation. We've talked about how families worked back then, the crazy power dynamics, and just how resilient people can be.
And as we finish up here, I want you to think about this. Joseph's story shows us that even when things seem impossible, when we face huge obstacles, there's always a chance for a new beginning. It reminds us that we all have the potential for both good and bad, and the choices we make, they determine what kind of person we become.
That's a great takeaway. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.